Well, let's stay on the subject and take a slightly different view now on the concept of changing our laws and whether it will stabilise coalition governments. This is a big topic in the country and extremely relevant just ahead of the 2024 elections scheduled to happen in a couple of months' time. Joel Bregman is a senior researcher at My Vote Counts. Joel, good evening to you and welcome. There are a number of issues, of course. We're looking at what's happening with the ICA and what they're presenting the court to the court to consider. And all of that might have an impact on the design and the impact of coalition governments. So just talk to us about, the nature of coalition governments in South Africa right now, and, how they are still essentially trapped in their own agendas, their own ideology, not necessarily focused on the core mandate, which is around service delivery.
Hi, thanks for having me. Nice to chat. So I think everyone's quite aware that there's a narrative around the dysfunctionality of coalition governments at the moment. SALGA, the South African Local Government Association, they estimate that out of the 80 municipalities currently in coalition government, 30 of them are deemed to be dysfunctional. And we've seen at metro level and at other municipalities, obviously Joburg's probably the example that most people point to, of mayors coming and going, service delivery being affected, paralysis in governance. And at the end of the day, it's really affecting people on the ground and the citizens. And unfortunately, we've reached a point in our politics where a lot of political parties are not fulfilling their duty of representing the needs of our voters and the public. And as we move to a point now where some of the major parties are pushing for legislation and for regulations around coalitions, we just need to be wary that whatever may come will be in the best interest of the people.
That's an interesting statistic that you've just shared with us, Joel, around the functionality of coalitions. You talked about 80 municipalities where they are present. At least 30 are said to be dysfunctional. That means there are lessons to be drawn from the 50 that ostensibly are working well. What are those lessons?
Correct. So I think one of the most important things as we move into a new era of coalition government is parties should be in a coalition when there's a joint commitment to a shared goal, a vision, a common purpose. Too often we see parties joining up together purely to get over the 50% plus one, just to get into power. And then you see things fall apart when there's egos, there's personalities, and there's a division around key issues.
Let's talk about, again, this issue that we opened up our program with, and this is the matter that's before the Apex Court, the role that independent candidates can play. And we spoke about it a lot in the run-up to the adoption of amendments to the Electoral Act. How can they change the picture significantly and kind of, in a sense, play a disruptive force, a constructive disruptive force in coalition and other politics in South Africa right now?
Well, I think the potential of independence is to be another form of accountability. A new type of politics is emerging, where the dominance of parties, especially of the ANC, is obviously waning. It's yet to be seen, how many independents will get their foot in the door. But I think it is quite exciting, and I think it's a nice alternative for voters as well. Something I just wanted to mention that from your previous segment on the changes to the Electoral Act. So something that is being touted by the bigger parties around coalitions is the introduction of this electoral threshold. Yeah. So the ANC, the DA, they want parties to win 1% of the vote to actually get into a council or a legislature. And first of all, this is really problematic. We think it's a shrinking of the political space. It would wipe out a lot of other parties from representation. But it also begs the question, how will this impact independent candidates? So I think that's another sort of spanner in the works that we need to start thinking about. And
as you've heard in our previous segment, it gives political parties, potentially an unfair advantage here. So again, how do you think the court can resolve this? Some would argue, it took us so long from the Constitutional Court's initial recommendation for reforms to the Electoral Act to finally, we got the discussion going and eventually, changes were made and then it was formalized into an act. Now we're back in court, again seeking to iterate what has already been, some of the work that's already been done this year. How do you think the court's likely to deal with that, and why is it important that they do so speedily? I mean, of course, notwithstanding the work of the IEC that gets heavily impacted.
Sure. So My Vote Counts, we actually took the position of not going to court on this matter because we understand the importance of the issue, and we do think that the process that led up to the new act was seriously problematic, and we do think that there are more stumbling blocks for independence. But we chose not to go to court because of the timeline, and we also understand that there is now going to be a new electoral reform panel, which is part of the new act. Part of the law says a new panel has to be set up, which will look further into more extensive reform in the long run. And I think it's important now just to secure next year's elections and ensure that they run smoothly.
In an effort to try and resolve or to build consensus really on, where to next for South Africa, particularly when it comes to the division of the spoils in the electoral space, there was this dialogue on coalition governments that were held. And, your writing on the matter kind of suggests that there really wasn't a meeting of the minds on this. And you've raised some of the issues during the course of our interview. Where to next? Because what we don't have in South Africa is the luxury of time. We've got a number of, deeply important issues to sort out. These are economic. These are around service delivery. It's around ensuring that people get, a humane level and standard of living in South Africa. So the political aspect of things have to be resolved, yesterday rather than tomorrow.
So there are certain issues which I think parties will never see eye to eye on. And the main one is the electoral threshold, because for smaller parties, it would be signing their own death warrant in a way in terms of representation. But I think there are two things. The first is that we really want and expect our political parties to move to a new culture where they are actually serving the needs of the people, not always of their own interests. So I think it's quite encouraging when we've seen some of the commitments from this multi-charter, the previous Moonshot Pact. And there are a number of shared visions, commitments, ways of issues that these parties see as being important to working, to pushing South Africa forward. So I think that's important. But then the other thing is that civil society, individuals need to start engaging with us. There's going to be legislation put forward to Parliament, and we need to ensure that it's not left to political parties to decide our future on this.
Joel, thank you very much for sharing your views and your perspective tonight. Joel Bregman is a senior researcher at My Vote Counts.